Hello, friends, and welcome to this lecture, which will be the first in a series of lectures on the United States Congress and of what we call legislative processes, how Congress works. That's just a fancy term to talk about how Congress works. We need to go back to fundamentals to begin with and realize that our system, that even though we're talking about the legislature, we're generally describing what is called a presidential system versus a parliamentary system. The U.S. has a presidential system, which is a minority in the community of nations or community of democratic nations. Most democracies are parliamentary systems. In fact, in 1960, a advisory group of the American Political Science Association even recommended that the U.S. consider adopting some parliamentary elements into our Congress and how it works. Was over 50 years ago now, and none of those proposals were accepted, but it shows the power of the ideas. So we're going to spend a moment comparing parliamentary and presidential systems to give us some kind of background as we now shift in our course to a study of the three major institutions in American politics: Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. Okay, well, one thing to keep in mind as we begin this is that most of our allies in the democratic world, as I mentioned, are parliamentary systems. Great Britain, Japan, the largest democracy in the world, India, is a parliamentary system as well. Usually in a parliamentary system, you only have a single body or you have one predominant body. For example, in England, the House of Commons is more important in many regards than the House of Lords, which is really a hereditary house of a legislative body. Keep in mind that when a parliament passes a law, it is, for the most part, enacted. In our system, we must go to the president. Both houses of the U.S. Congress, the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, pass a law, the president still must sign it into law. We'll be talking more about that when we turn to the presidency next, in this course. The executive power is housed in a cabinet in a parliamentary system. Cabinet members are usually members of that parliament, that legislative body, that are of the same and the dominant political party. The prime minister is also a member of that majority party or part of a coalition. So they have a kind of shared purpose. It's much easier to pass legislation in a parliamentary system than it is in a presidential system, because the president may be a member of one party and the majority of both bodies of the legislature may be in the hands of another party. So you have what we call divided government. So keep that in mind. The cabinet, the group of senior advisors, what we would call in a presidential system secretaries, like Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. The cabinet is really what works often in opposition, or in many ways keeps the parliament in check, because as a collective group, they monitor the parliament and are really the liaison of the prime minister. Now, in our system and a few other presidential systems that exist, is the key factor in terms of the difference between that system and a parliamentary system is a separation of powers. In a parliamentary system, the prime minister, the executive, always comes from the majority party in parliament. They elect their own, in other words. In the United States, our system, our presidential system, we elect the president separately. The president could have in the past been a member of Congress. The president could have been a federal judge, could have been a governor, but we elect the president separately and for a different term, the 4-year term. In the United States, the House is Representatives is a 2-year term, the Senate is a 6-year term. So the president is different. Also, there are no limits on members of Congress and how many times they can run for office. We have the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms or 10 years in office. And so they're really very different in how they operate. Let's look at some advantages and disadvantages of a parliamentary system, which might give us more insight as we begin to turn to the U.S. Congress and how it operates. Some of the advantages is that you always have a unified government. You always have the government that is of the majority party, so it's much easier, as I mentioned, to pass legislation. There's also greater party discipline. Members of the party know that they better support the party and vote with the party, or they may suffer the political consequences. And also, there's a great deal of encouragement for them to do so and rewards for them to do so. There's really no veto power from the executive or judicial review like we have in the United States, where the Supreme Court can rule an act of Congress, strike it down as unconstitutional. There are also, in a parliamentary system, clear lines of responsibility, that the government in power is responsible for the actions of government. When things aren't going well, they risk their survivability and their time in office. Let's look at some disadvantages. Divided government, as the United States has it, had very often in the course of the last half century, executive from one party, members of Congress, the control of Congress in the hands of the other party, keeps them both in check. They have to compromise. It resists extreme proposals. So this is impossible in parliamentary systems. So we describe this as a disadvantage. As I mentioned, there is no executive check, no veto as we have in the United States. So this again is also a potential disadvantage of a parliamentary system. Also, an additional and a very serious disadvantage is if there is no majority elected from any particular party in any given election. There's not a clear prime minister. There's chaos, potentially. What happens in practice is the political parties come together and form a coalition, just like we have in many parts of the world today. It is almost inevitable that, for example, in Israel, that when the Knesset, the Israeli legislature, the Israeli parliament meets and has elections, that there is a coalition, sometimes of parties that are very much at odds with each other. So this makes for very exciting politics, but also for some potential problems as well. Some other key differences. It's easier for a president in a presidential system to act without the support of Congress. And sometimes presidents really are seen as the leading force in terms of foreign policy in the 21st century. And presidents act sometimes very decisively, even if it might have been against the prevailing views in Congress. We recruit political leaders differently in a presidential system. And so they work in an environment that is really quite different from a parliamentary system. And so when we begin now to look at Congress, we have to keep in mind that ours is a presidential system. Congress is elected separately from the president. While Congress can pass legislation, the president must sign them into law or veto them to prevent them from becoming law. So we have a very different system. We have the minority system of a legislature among the world's democracies. So that's where we're going to begin now, is shift and turn to, in our next lecture, the U.S. Congress. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.